What if the one person you trusted most in your home was hiding an identity that could destroy everything? What if the man you were beginning to trust had a secret buried so deep even he had stopped looking at it? And what if a little girl, 8 years old, with a crayon drawing and an unshakable certainty, was the only reason any of it was holding together at all? Welcome back. If you are new here, here is what you missed. Gareth Whitmore, wealthy, controlled, and allergic to anything that didn't fit neatly into his world, was forced by his own daughter to make an impossible choice. Ellie didn't want the 5 professional nannies he had lined up. She wanted Nora, the housekeeper, the woman who had been quietly showing up for her every single day for 6 years, while her father was busy maintaining appearances. Gareth resisted. Ellie held up a drawing she had made of the two of them, and that was it. Game over. Nora got the job, the house started to feel like a home, and everyone exhaled. Or so it seemed. Because in part 2, someone has been watching, someone patient and calculating and carrying a grudge that is 9 years old and has never cooled. She has hired a journalist. She has dug up a name that Nora buried 11 years ago and never wanted anyone to find. And she has documents, financial documents, that tell a very particular story about Gareth Whitmore. A story that is missing some crucial pages, pages that, in the wrong hands, could ruin him completely. The twist is coming. You will not see it. We promise you that. And the ending, which we are not touching, will leave you with something you were not expecting to feel. Stay until the end. It matters. The estate had never been quieter, yet somehow it had never felt more alive. 3 months had passed since Nora stepped into her new role, and the rhythm of the house had changed in ways Gareth hadn't expected. Where there had once been sterile efficiency, there was now laughter. Where there had once been careful distance, there was now something warmer, something that Gareth couldn't quite name, but found himself gravitating toward more and more with every passing day. He would stand at the top of the staircase sometimes, just listening to the sound of Ellie and Nora in the garden below, their voices floating up through the open windows like music he hadn't realized he had been missing. It unsettled him in the best possible way, but not everything had softened. The whispers among the staff had not completely died down. If anything, they had taken on a new shape, a quieter, more dangerous kind of murmuring, the kind that happened behind closed doors and stopped the moment Nora entered a room. Mrs. Calloway, the head of household operations, had been the most vocal about her displeasure. She was a woman of 62 with iron gray hair pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch the skin at her temples, and she carried herself with the kind of authority that came from 3 decades of service in houses far grander than this one. She had never said anything directly to Nora's face. She was too clever for that. But her disapproval ran through the house like a cold current beneath warm water, and everyone felt it. Nora felt it most of all. One Tuesday morning, as Ellie sat at the kitchen island working through her maths problems, Nora noticed that the supply list she had submitted for Ellie's art materials had been quietly ignored for the 3rd week in a row. The paints Ellie needed for her school project were still missing. The brushes she had requested hadn't arrived, and when Nora asked about it gently at the weekly staff briefing, Mrs. Calloway had looked at her with a smile so thin it could have cut glass and said, "Those requests go through the proper channels, Nora. I'm sure you understand." Nora had nodded, said nothing, and gone back upstairs to help Ellie improvise with what they had. But that evening, after Ellie was asleep, Nora sat at the small desk in her room and stared at the wall for a long time. She wasn't afraid of Mrs. Calloway. She had faced harder things in her life than a disapproving housekeeper, but she was afraid of something else, something she couldn't quite articulate. She was afraid of what would happen when the novelty of Gareth's decision wore off, when the quiet approval he had offered in that office 3 months ago began to fade under the pressure of everything he had built his life around, because she had seen it beginning already. Small things, the way Gareth's eyes sometimes lingered on her a beat too long when they passed each other in the hallway, then looked away just as quickly. The way he had started joining Ellie's evening story sessions, sitting in the armchair by the window while Nora read aloud, pretending to scroll through his phone but never actually looking at it. The way his voice had changed when he spoke to her, softer than before, less the clipped authority of an employer and more something else entirely. Nora had told herself she was imagining it. She had told herself it was the natural warmth that comes when people share something as important as the care of a child. She had told herself a great many things that she was becoming less and less convinced by. Meanwhile, across town in a sleek glass office building that overlooked the financial district, a woman named Vivian Ashford sat behind a mahogany desk and opened a manila folder that had been delivered to her that morning by a private courier. Inside were photographs, 12 of them, printed in sharp, high resolution. They showed the exterior of Gareth Whitmore's estate, his car in the driveway, his daughter in the garden, and Nora standing beside Ellie, laughing at something neither the camera nor Vivian could hear. Vivian studied each photograph carefully, one by one, before setting them down and folding her hands on the desk. She was 40 years old, with the kind of beauty that had always been described as severe, all sharp angles and steady eyes and a mouth that rarely smiled unless she wanted something. She had been Gareth's fiancée once, 7 years ago, before everything had fallen. Apart in the way that things between ambitious people tend to fall apart loudly and completely and with lawyers. She had moved on, built her own empire, her own reputation, her own life. She had told herself she had no interest in Gareth Whitmore or anything that belonged to him. But then she had heard the rumors about the housekeeper, about the nanny position, about the way the household had apparently reorganized itself around a woman who had no formal qualifications and no last name anyone seemed to know much about. Vivian had found the rumors irritating in a way she hadn't expected, and Vivian Ashford paid very close attention to anything that irritated her unexpectedly, because in her experience, unexpected irritation was almost always a sign that something important was at stake. She picked up her phone and dialed. "Find out everything you can about a woman named Nora," she said when the line picked up. "She works for Gareth Whitmore. I want to know where she came from, who she is, and why she's still there." She paused, then added, "And be thorough. I have a feeling this one isn't as simple as she looks." Back at the estate, that same evening, Ellie had fallen asleep mid-sentence, which was her habit when she was particularly content. Nora tucked the blanket around her shoulders and sat for a moment on the edge of the bed, watching the slow rise and fall of the little girl's chest. There were times, quiet moments like this one, when the love she felt for Ellie was so vast it almost frightened her. She hadn't planned for this. She had come to this house 6 years ago with a single bag and a letter of recommendation from a family in Edinburgh, who had since moved to Canada. She had been hired as a housekeeper, had learned the rhythms of the house, had found her place in its machinery. And then Ellie had arrived, a small, solemn, wide-eyed child of 3 who had lost her mother 18 months before and who had looked at Nora on her first morning in the house and said, in the most matter-of-fact voice imaginable, "You have kind eyes." Nora had never recovered from that. She leaned down and pressed the softest kiss to Ellie's forehead, then stood, turned off the lamp, and slipped quietly out of the room. In the hallway, she nearly collided with Gareth. He was still dressed from the day, his tie loosened, his jacket over one arm, clearly on his way to check on Ellie as he had been doing every night for the past few weeks. They both stopped. There was a moment, one of those moments that seems to last much longer than it actually does, where neither of them spoke. "She's asleep," Nora said softly. Gareth nodded. "Good." He didn't move. Neither did she. "You look tired," he said, and there was something in his voice that made the observation feel like something more than an observation. "I'm fine," Nora said, which was what she always said, and which was, as was often the case, only partially true. Gareth looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded again. "Right, well, good night, Nora." "Good night, Mr. Whitmore." She walked down the hall to her room. She did not look back, but she heard him standing in the hallway for a long moment before she heard the quiet creak of Ellie's door opening and then gently closing again. She sat on her bed in the dark for a long time after that, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the silence of the house around her. Somewhere in the east wing, a clock ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the estate's old oak trees with a sound like breathing. And in that silence, Nora felt the thing she had been trying not to feel for longer than she cared to admit, pressing against the inside of her chest, like a tide that had been rising slowly, steadily, and without her permission. This was going to get complicated. She had known it from the beginning, if she was being honest with herself, which she tried to be, even when it was inconvenient. But knowing something was coming and knowing how to stop it were, she understood now, very different things entirely. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, while Ellie was at her piano lesson and Gareth was in a board meeting that was running 40 minutes over schedule. Nora was in the laundry room folding a stack of Ellie's school shirts with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing domestic work long enough that her hands worked independently of her thoughts, when Mrs. Calloway appeared in the doorway with an expression that managed to be both neutral and deeply loaded at the same time. "There's someone at the front gate," Mrs. Calloway said. "A woman. She says she's a journalist. She's asking for you by name." Nora set down the shirt she was folding very slowly and carefully. "By name," she repeated. "Nora Brent, specifically," Mrs. Calloway said, and something flickered in her eyes that Nora didn't like at all. "Shall I send her away, or would you like to handle it yourself?" Nora kept her expression perfectly still. It was a skill she had developed young and refined over many years, the ability to make her face say less than she was thinking. "Send her away, please," she said evenly. "I don't speak to journalists." Mrs. Calloway nodded, the flicker in her eyes replaced by something harder and more satisfied. "Of course," she said, and left. Nora waited until her footsteps had faded completely before she sat down on the wooden stool beside the washing machine and pressed both hands flat against her thighs to stop them from trembling. It had been 11 years. 11 years since she had left London with a new name, a new history, and a determination to build something quiet and real and far away from the world she had grown up in. 11 years since she had last heard the name Nora Brent spoken aloud by anyone other than herself. The name she had been born with, the name she had used until the day everything collapsed, was Eleanor Bryce. And Eleanor Bryce had once been very famous and then very notorious, and then, after a particular sequence of events that had destroyed several careers and one marriage, very carefully invisible. She had been 22 when it happened, a junior analyst at a financial firm that had turned out to be running a scheme sophisticated enough to fool even the most experienced regulatory bodies. She had known nothing about it. The investigation had eventually cleared her completely. But investigations take time, and in that time, the newspapers had done what newspapers do, and Eleanor Bryce's face had been everywhere, and her name had meant something toxic and complicated, and she had been, in every practical sense, unemployable. She had reinvented herself. It was not as difficult as people imagined if you were willing to give up everything that made you recognizable. She had moved from London to Edinburgh. She had trained in domestic service, which no one who had known Eleanor Bryce would ever have imagined, which was precisely the point. She had built a new reputation slowly and carefully on the simple foundation of being excellent at her work and discreet about everything else. She had come to the Whitmore estate as Nora, and she had been Nora for 6 years, and for a long time she had believed that Eleanor Bryce was buried deeply enough to stay buried. But journalists had long memories, and someone, somewhere, had pointed one in her direction. She stood up, picked up the shirt she had been folding, and finished folding it with hands that had steadied themselves through sheer force of will. She had built this life on quiet determination. She was not going to let it unravel without a fight. She thought about going to Gareth. She stood in the hallway outside his office that evening, hand raised to knock, for almost 2 full minutes before she lowered it and walked away. She couldn't do it. Not yet. Not without knowing how much they had. Not without understanding exactly what was coming before she was forced to explain something she had never told a single person in this house, in this life. She would handle it herself first. That was what she had always done. 2 days later, on a Saturday when Gareth had taken Ellie into the city for her quarterly dental appointment and a promised lunch at the restaurant she loved, a black car turned slowly into the road that ran along the east edge of the estate's perimeter wall. Nora was standing at the gate when it stopped. The woman who got out was not what she had expected. She was young, no more than 30, with a notebook under her arm and an expression that was more nervous than predatory. That made Nora more cautious, not less. The dangerous ones were often the nervous ones. "Miss Brent," the woman said, then seemed to catch herself. "I'm sorry, I know that's not the name you use." "What do you want?" Nora said, not as a question. "My name is Kara Flynn. I work for a magazine called The Inside Story. I was given your photograph and told you were worth looking into." She paused. "I want you to know. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I was also told things about you that I'm trying to verify, and I thought you deserved the chance to speak before anything was printed." Nora studied her for a long moment. "Who gave you my photograph?" Kara hesitated. "I can't say. Source protection. Then we have nothing to talk about." Nora turned. "Wait," Kara said, and something in her voice made Nora stop. Not desperation. Something more careful than that. "I was also given something else. Something that wasn't about your past. It was about this household. About Gareth Whitmore's finances." Nora turned back slowly. "What about them?" "There are documents," Kara said quietly. "Financial documents. Someone is claiming that Gareth Whitmore has been involved in a series of offshore holdings that may not be entirely legal. And someone is also claiming, which is why your name came up at all, that you may have noticed something in your time here, that a person with your background, with your financial experience, would have had access to certain records." The air between them went very still. "My background," Nora said carefully, "is that of a housekeeper." "Your previous background," Kara said. "Eleanor Bryce's background." Nora looked at this young woman for a long, careful moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Whoever sent you here is not trying to run a story about me. They're trying to use me to run a story about Gareth, and they picked me because they think I have something to lose. Do you understand what that means?" Kara blinked. "It means whoever your source is, they knew exactly what they were doing, and you should ask yourself very carefully whose interests you're actually serving." She held the young woman's gaze for another moment, then turned and walked back toward the house without looking back. Her mind was already moving in 3 directions at once. Someone had done a great deal of research. Someone had connected Eleanor Bryce to Nora. Someone knew she was here, knew what role she now played in this household, and had decided that she could be useful. The only question was who. And somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the careful logic she was applying to the problem, a name was forming. A name she had heard only once, spoken by Jessica in passing, almost too casually, a month ago. Vivian Ashford. She hadn't thought about it then. She was thinking about it now. That evening when Gareth returned with Ellie, laughing about something that had apparently happened at the restaurant, involving a very flustered waiter and an impressively large dessert, Nora watched him from the kitchen doorway with an expression that she was very careful to keep light and warm. She watched him ruffle Ellie's hair and listened to her recount the story 3 more times. She watched the way he relaxed in this house now, in a way he hadn't 3 months ago. She thought about financial documents and offshore holdings and a woman with iron gray hair who smiled like a knife. She thought about a young journalist with a nervous expression and a source she wouldn't name. And she thought about Eleanor Bryce, who had once believed that innocence was sufficient protection, and who had learned, at significant cost, that it was not. She was not going to make that mistake again. The breakthrough came, as breakthroughs often do, from an entirely unexpected direction. It was Ellie who found it, or rather, it was Ellie's habit of wandering that led to the discovery, a habit Nora had never quite managed to curb, partly because she secretly believed that children who wandered were children who were curious, and curiosity was something Nora valued above almost all other qualities. It was a rainy Wednesday, the kind of gray, persistent rain that makes an estate feel like the last house at the edge of the world. Ellie had grown bored of her drawing and had gone exploring, as she sometimes did, through the parts of the house that were rarely used. The East Wing guest rooms, the old library on the 2nd floor, the long corridor that ran behind the main staircase and smelled of old wood and something Ellie had once described as the past. She had a particular fondness for the small sitting room at the end of that corridor, a room that had apparently belonged to Gareth's mother and had been largely untouched since her death 15 years ago. Nora knew about this room. She had dusted it herself many times and had always felt a particular kind of stillness in it, the kind that collects in spaces where someone was once very alive. What she had not known, and what Ellie discovered on that rainy Wednesday, was that the writing desk in the corner of that room had a false bottom. Ellie had not been snooping precisely. She had been pressing her fingers along the underside of the desk in the way that children do, exploring surfaces for the pleasure of texture, when the panel had released with a soft click and revealed a shallow compartment containing a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon that had once been red and had faded to the color of dried rose petals. Ellie had brought the letters to Nora immediately, which was a mark of her character that Nora thought about for a long time afterward. Another child might have read them. Ellie had brought them without opening a single one, saying only, "I think these might be important. They feel important." Nora had held them for a moment. They were addressed in a handwriting she didn't recognize, but the name on the first envelope stopped her completely. The name was not Gareth's mother's name. The name was Gareth's, and the return address was a town in France that Nora recognized with a jolt of cold surprise, because it was the same small coastal town in Normandy, where she knew from a conversation she had never been meant to overhear that Gareth's company held one of its more discreet offshore accounts. She did not read the letters. She sat with that decision for a long moment, the bundle in her hands, the rain against the window, Ellie watching her with those serious dark eyes. Then she placed them carefully back in the compartment and told Ellie, in the gentlest possible voice, that they should leave them where they were for now and that she would speak to her father about them. Ellie had nodded, asked no questions, and gone back to her drawing. It was one of the things Nora loved most about her, That evening, Nora made two decisions. The first was that she needed to tell Gareth, not about the letters alone, but about everything. About the journalist, about the source, about Vivian Ashford or whoever it was pulling strings she couldn't yet fully trace, about Eleanor Bryce. She had been carrying this alone because that was her instinct and her habit. But she understood now that she was no longer just a housekeeper navigating a private history. She was standing in the middle of something that involved Gareth and Ellie, and a past that was not entirely her own, and she had no right to make decisions about that without him. The second decision was harder. She needed to know what was in those letters before she handed them over, not to use them, not to protect herself, but because she needed to understand what she was walking him into. She was not Eleanor Bryce anymore, and she was also not simply Nora. She was somewhere between the two, in a place that had its own kind of knowledge, its own particular way of seeing, and everything she could see right now was telling her that Gareth Whitmore did not know everything about his own affairs. She went back to the sitting room at midnight, when the house was fully asleep and even Mrs. Calloway's narrow slice of light beneath her bedroom door had gone dark. She sat at the desk, untied the ribbon with hands that were very steady, and read. It took her 40 minutes. By the time she retied the ribbon and replaced the bundle in its compartment, she understood several things she had not understood before. The letters were from a man named Robert Ashford, Vivian's younger brother. They dated back 9 years, written to Gareth in a tone that moved across the span of months, from professional warmth to something strained, and finally to something that read, unmistakably, like fear. The final letter, dated 8 years and 11 months ago, was not long. It said only, "Gareth, I have done what you asked, all of it. I need you to know that I did it because I believed in you, and because I trusted you, and because you told me it was temporary. I am asking you now, for the last time, to make it right. If you do not, I don't know what I will do. I don't know what I am anymore." Robert Ashford had died 7 months after that letter was written. A boating accident off the coast of Brittany, Vivian's brother, the same coastal town in Normandy, the same offshore account. Nora sat in the dark for a very long time. Then she went to bed and lay awake until dawn. And by the time the first gray light came through her curtains, she had made a third decision. She needed to find out whether Gareth knew, because there were two very different versions of the man she had come to know over the past 3 months, and the truth of who he actually was depended entirely on which one of them had written the instructions that had broken Robert Ashford and ultimately, she suspected, helped kill him. She also, for the first time, allowed herself to admit something she had been refusing to look at directly. She cared what the answer was. She cared in a way that went well beyond her duty to Ellie, well beyond professional concern, well beyond anything that was safe or sensible, given her position in this house. She cared because somewhere between the evenings in the armchair and the quiet hallway exchanges and the particular way he had looked at her the night she told him Ellie was sleeping, Gareth Whitmore had become something to her that she had not given him permission to become. And that, she understood now, was the most dangerous complication of all. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not the one she had planned. She had intended to speak to Gareth the following evening, after Ellie was asleep, in his study where the conversation could be controlled. What actually happened was that Gareth came to find her. He appeared in the kitchen at 7 in the morning before Ellie was awake, before the rest of the staff had fully arrived, carrying a piece of paper in one hand and wearing an expression that she had never seen on his face before. It was not anger. It was not the tightly controlled authority she had learned to read so well. It was something rawer and more frightened than either of those things. He placed the piece of paper on the kitchen island between them. It was a printed email, from an address she didn't recognize, addressed to Gareth, 3 lines. She isn't who she says she is. Ask her about Eleanor Bryce, and ask her what she's found in your house." He was watching her very carefully, and Nora, who had spent 11 years being very good at keeping her face still, found, to her own considerable surprise, that she couldn't do it. Not to him, not right now. The silence that followed was the kind that could go in any direction, the kind that contains the compressed weight of everything that has not yet been said. Nora looked at the printed email on the kitchen island, then looked up at Gareth and made the decision that she had been approaching from a great distance for a very long time. She told him everything. She began with Eleanor Bryce, with the firm in London, and the investigation and the newspapers, with the years of reinvention and the choice of a new name in a new city, and the slow, deliberate work of becoming someone trustworthy from the ground up. She told it plainly, without apology, and without excessive explanation, because she had learned long ago that the truth spoken plainly is more credible than the truth dressed in justification. She watched his face while she spoke. It moved through several things: surprise, then something sharper and more complicated, then a stillness that she couldn't quite read. When she finished that part, she paused. Then she told him about the journalist, about the source she wouldn't name, about the name Vivian Ashford, which she had been turning over in her mind for weeks. And then, because she had decided that there was no longer any halfway point available to her, she told him about the sitting room and the desk and the letters. She told him she had read them. She didn't apologize for that either, because an apology would have been dishonest. She had made a choice, and she stood by it. She told him Robert Ashford's name. She watched the stillness in his face break. What replaced it was something she hadn't anticipated. Not guilt, not the defensive hardening of a man caught out. What she saw was grief. Real, unguarded, old grief. The kind that has been carrying weight for years and has forgotten how heavy it is until someone names the thing. Gareth pulled out a stool and sat down at the kitchen island, heavily, like a man who has been standing for a very long time. He put his hands flat on the surface and looked at them for a long moment. "Robert was my friend," he said finally, his voice very low. "Before he was Vivian's brother, before any of the business, he was my friend. We met at university." He stopped. "The offshore accounts were his idea, not mine. He came to me 8 years ago with a structure he'd developed, legal at the time, or close enough to legal that the lines were blurred. I went along with it because I trusted him and because the returns were good, and because I was 20 years younger than I am now and not as careful as I should have been." He paused again. "When it started to become clear that it wasn't as clean as we'd thought, Robert panicked. I tried to unwind it. It took time, more time than it should have. He wrote me those letters." He looked up. "I wrote back. I told him we were handling it. I thought we were handling it." His jaw tightened. "He died before we finished. The boating accident. It was an accident. I know that because I have spent the better part of 9 years being absolutely certain it was an accident. But Vivian never believed it, and I think she has spent a very long time looking for a way to prove I was responsible for her brother's death." Nora looked at him steadily. "Were you?" "Not directly," Gareth said, "but the stress I allowed him to carry, the time I let it go on, the way I managed it with a degree of composure he couldn't match because it was his idea, and he felt the weight of that differently than I did." He stopped. "I will carry that for the rest of my life. But I did not cause his death, and I am not the man those letters make me look like, in isolation, without context." He looked at her. "I need you to decide whether you believe that." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I already decided," she said, "before you said a word." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You should have come to me sooner, when the journalist showed up." I know, she said. I'm used to handling things alone. So am I, he said. It's not always an advantage. There was a brief, extraordinary moment where the air between them felt very thin. Then footsteps on the stairs broke it apart, small and unhurried, and they both turned as Ellie appeared, in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, her hair in the particular state of architectural chaos it achieved by morning, holding her sketchbook under one arm and looking between them with the clear-eyed assessment of a child who has been watching adults for long enough to know when something important is happening. Are you two having a serious conversation? She asked. Yes, Nora said. Is it nearly finished? Gareth looked at Nora. Almost, he said. Ellie considered this, then climbed onto a stool at the opposite end of the island, opened her sketchbook, and began drawing without another word. It was such a perfect piece of Ellie that both adults almost smiled at the same time, and almost catching each other, almost smiling, was its own kind of thing, quiet and warm and impossible to misread. They moved quickly after that. Gareth called his lawyer within the hour. The financial records were reviewed again, this time with the explicit purpose of understanding exactly what Vivian might have in her possession and how it compared to the documented reality. The answer, as it turned out, was that she had fragments. Suggestive ones, certainly, selective ones, the kind that told a very specific story if you didn't have the full picture. But fragments were not evidence, and evidence was not proof. And Gareth's lawyers were extraordinarily good at the distance between those three things. By midday, 2 letters had been sent, one to Kara Flynn at the Inside Story via her editor, outlining the full documented history of the offshore accounts, including the timeline of their unwinding and the regulatory clearance that had followed, along with a polite but clear indication that any publication proceeding without this context would be legally challenged. The second letter was addressed to Vivian Ashford directly. Gareth wrote it himself in his study, with the door closed. He didn't show it to Nora before he sent it. She didn't ask to see it. Some things were between old wounds and the people who carried them. Mrs. Calloway resigned that afternoon. She appeared in Gareth's office at 3 o'clock, placed an envelope on his desk, said, "I believe you'll find everything in order," and left. Nobody was surprised. In the weeks that followed, the house underwent a quieter and more lasting change than any of the dramatic ones that had preceded it. Gareth promoted Nora formally with a new contract and a title and a salary that reflected what she had actually been doing for 6 years, rather than what her job description had previously said. He also, with her permission, told the remaining staff the true nature of her history, not to expose her, but because he had decided quite firmly that this house was going to operate on honesty, and that honesty had to begin with him. The response from the staff was not uniformly warm. 2 people left within the month. The others stayed, and in the way of households that have been through something genuinely difficult, there developed between those who remained a quiet solidarity that was more durable than the polished efficiency that had existed before. Ellie, for her part, noticed everything and asked very few questions. She seemed to understand in the way that children sometimes understand things before they can articulate them, that the house was becoming something more like what a home is supposed to be, and that this was a slow process and a fragile one and not to be pressed too hard. She continued her mornings in the garden with Nora. She continued her evening story sessions. She began, gradually and without announcement, to include her father in the drawings she made of people she loved. Gareth noticed this. He didn't say anything about it, but Nora caught him looking at one of those drawings one morning, a simple pencil sketch of 3 figures standing in a garden with a large sun overhead, and she saw something move across his face that she recognized because she had felt it herself. The particular overwhelm of being included in something you didn't know you needed until you were in it. Vivian Ashford did not respond to the letter. There were no more journalists. There were no more mysterious emails. Whether she had decided the battle was unwinnable or whether she had simply retreated to reconsider was impossible to say. Nora suspected the latter. Vivian struck her as someone who played long games, but she also suspected that Vivian had not anticipated the particular configuration of people she was dealing with. She had expected to find leverage and isolation. What she had found instead was a household that had, improbably and through considerable difficulty, learned how to hold together. On the last Saturday of the month, Gareth found Nora in the old sitting room. She was dusting the writing desk, which she did with a particular care that she couldn't quite explain, as though the room deserved tenderness. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "London? The finance world?" She considered this properly. "I miss knowing I was good at something," she said finally. "I don't miss the world itself." "You're good at this," he said. "At Ellie. At the house." He paused. "At everything, actually." She turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and an expression that was making no attempt to be anything other than what it was. "Gareth," she said, in a voice that was meant to be a gentle warning and came out as something softer. "I know," he said. "I know what the objections are. I've been making them to myself for about 6 weeks." "They're good objections," she said. "They are," he agreed. "I still think we should have dinner." The silence stretched out. Through the window, the last light of the afternoon was doing something extraordinary to the old oak trees at the edge of the estate, turning them the color of amber and copper. Somewhere downstairs, Ellie was practicing her piano, the same 4 bars she had been working on for 2 weeks, patient and unhurried and completely certain she would get it right. "It would complicate things," Nora said, though she was no longer quite looking at the desk she was supposed to be dusting. "Things are already complicated," Gareth said. "They've been complicated for some time." This was, she thought, entirely true, and she had faced complicated things before, had faced them with far fewer resources than she currently had. She had reinvented herself once from nothing. She knew how to navigate difficult terrain. She knew how to be honest even when it cost her something. She knew now that she did not have to do any of it alone. "Dinner," she said. "Not in this house. Somewhere else." "Anywhere you like," Gareth said, and the careful neutrality he had been maintaining for months broke open into something so genuinely warm that it was almost startling, like sun after a very long winter. Downstairs, Ellie finally got the 4 bars right. The notes rang through the house, clear and bright and unhesitating, and both of them heard it, and both of them smiled, and for a long moment neither of them needed to say anything at all. And that is where we leave them. Gareth standing in a doorway, Nora holding a dustcloth she forgot she was holding, Ellie's piano notes hanging in the air like a promise. 3 people who found each other through conflict and stubbornness, and the kind of slow, honest reckoning that most people spend their whole lives avoiding. It is not a perfect ending. But then, the best stories never end perfectly. They end truthfully. And the truth here is that something real has been built in that house, something that neither titles nor old wounds nor carefully engineered conspiracies could dismantle, because it was built on the one foundation that actually holds: the choice to show up, fully, honestly, even when it is terrifying. But here is what we have not told you yet. Vivian Ashford did not disappear. She retreated, and retreating for a woman like Vivian is never the same thing as giving up. There is a second envelope, one that was never sent, one that contains something far more explosive than financial documents or old letters or a journalist with a nervous expression, something that connects Nora's past to Gareth's present in a way that neither of them has seen coming, something that will force Ellie to ask a question, that will stop everyone in the room completely still, and something that will make you rethink everything you thought you understood about how this story began. We have the next part written. It is ready. All it needs is you. If this video hits 1,000 views, we post part 3. No delays, no waiting, no conditions beyond that number. You decide whether this story continues. Share it with one person who loves a good story. Drop a comment telling us what you think Vivian's secret is, because some of you are going to be very close and we want to see it. Hit the like button if Nora and Gareth's dinner deserves to happen. And subscribe and turn on the bell, because when part 3 drops, it will drop without warning, and you do not want to miss the moment that changes everything. 1,000 views. That is all. The story is waiting. The question is whether you want to see where it goes. We think you do.